The wind dragged dust like a tired curtain across the outskirts of Dry Creek, and behind it came a woman walking slow, shawl drawn close against the spite of the plains. Her boots were too thin for the road, her breath too short for the hill, and her belly, round and ripe, told stories she would not speak. She passed under the broken sign of the town's only chapel, its bell long since stolen for scrap, and did not look up. A raven called once and fell silent. No one welcomed her. She stopped beside the old water well, the one near the feed store where the boys loitered when the weather was fine. They watched her like they'd spotted something sick in the trail, a thing to pity but not to touch. One laughed too loud, elbowing the other. The woman stood still, hands on her back, then dipped the bucket and drank from a rusted tin ladle. Her hair was damp at the temples from walking, her coat patched with the kind of thread that told you how long she'd gone without help. A curtain twitched in the boarding house above, another in the mercantile. No one opened a door. Up the hill, just beyond the blacksmith's barn, someone watched from a slant of shadow, a man with braids and a calm, unreadable face. He leaned against a post near the edge of the pines, knife at his belt, with shavings at his feet. He did not move when the woman collapsed to her knees by the well, only narrowed his eyes a little, as though trying to understand something the rest of the town had no use for. The sheriff walked past her and said nothing. That night, Dry Creek turned cold, the kind of cold that crept between the logs of cabins and made the goats cry low in their pens. The woman curled inside the widow's shack, the one no one had touched since Mabel Crest died, and pulled her shawl over her belly. The hearth had no wood, only ash from some other time. Her hands shook when she held them to her mouth. She whispered something to the child inside her, something like a promise or a prayer. Just before dawn, the floor creaked. She sat up, clutching a kitchen knife no longer sharp. But when she opened the door, no one stood there, only wind, and a small burlap sack laid careful as an offering. Inside it, 3 pieces of cornbread, rough but warm, and a strip of dried venison tied with twine. She stood a long time in the doorway, staring out at the empty, frost-bitten street. In the days that followed, she found other small things. A bundle of kindling stacked beneath the overhang, a repaired hinge on the back window, a bar of soap wrapped in a scrap of flannel and tied with a single eagle feather. The townsfolk noticed. "That one's been sniffing around," said Mrs. Penwell to the hat maker. "The redskin, the one up near the trees." "They say he don't speak a word," said the millboy. "Not since the war. Not since his brother hanged." The woman never answered the questions whispered near her. She moved quiet, tending to what she could. She swept the porch with a frayed broom and fetched water at dusk when the road was empty. She took in sewing, though few gave her work. Those who did left the fabric at her step and took back the bundles without a thank you. Still she endured. Once she caught him watching, just a glimpse through the trees. He stood straight, eyes steady, arms crossed over a chest wrapped in old cavalry canvas. She thought perhaps he meant to frighten her, but he only nodded, slow and solemn. She returned the gesture, unsure why her throat felt tight. The next day, she left half a loaf of sour bread on a fence post, near where he'd been standing. He didn't take it right away, but by the next morning, it was gone. Children played games with rocks and sticks nearby, then paused when she passed. "That's the widow," one whispered. "The one thrown out. Pa says her baby ain't right." She kept walking, face turned to the wind. Spring hadn't come, but the snow was retreating like a dog scolded too many times. Mud clung to boots and wagons, and the town returned to its gossip. It was the cornbread that started it all, they said. Or maybe the night he'd been seen sharpening his blade near her steps. "She's taken up with him," said one. "She's got no shame." The preacher's wife shook her head. "She's already cursed. Let her have her ghost." The woman lit her hearth for the first time that week. The flame caught slow and uncertain, like her hope. She wrapped herself in a quilt and stared into the orange light, thinking of the man who had once vowed to build her a home. He had died in a mining collapse the month she told him she was with child. His kin had offered her one night of roof, one prayer of grief, and then said she had brought bad luck into their blood. That had been in another town, another lifetime. On the 7th night, As wind peeled around the corners of her roof and owls cried from the ridge, she heard a knock, not sharp, not urgent. She opened the door and found him standing there. No words passed between them. He held out a single item, a freshly carved spoon, smooth and light, with a feather etched into the handle. She took it from his hand, her fingers brushing his knuckles. They were warm. Then he turned and left. She watched him disappear into the trees without asking his name, though she'd heard it before. Chaitin, they called him. Thunderbird. A name too big for a man so quiet. The next morning, she made porridge with a spoon and wept into her bowl, not from sadness, but something else. Something beginning. And beyond the far edge of town, past the fields no one planted anymore, a fire burned in the woods, steady, waiting, and patient as the man who kept it. Snow began to crust the town's edges like old salt, curling around fence posts and boot soles. Dry Creek went quiet in winter, but not kind. The wind didn't scream. It whispered things you'd rather not hear, and the folk who didn't leave learned to live with its watching silence. She learned quickly. Her days were spent in simple, necessary motion, chopping potatoes with stiff fingers, mending sleeves with dull needles, stirring thin broth while counting out breaths. The baby moved more now, small, urgent flutters beneath her ribs that reminded her the road forward had no pause. At night, she kept one hand over her belly and the other over her heart. He kept coming. Not close, not often, but enough that she began to see his rhythm in the shape of the days. A wrapped bundle of firewood placed neatly beside the door. A pail of water left full after she'd gone to bed. Once, a fur-lined shawl folded and set just beneath the window where wind slipped through. He never knocked again. She found herself waiting, without admitting it, watching the tree lean as she fetched water, listening for the tread of boots that were lighter than a hunter's, heavier than a ghost's. When she saw him once across the way, shoulders squared as he dragged a felled branch toward his fire pit, she raised a hand without thinking. He paused, then nodded once, like a promise passed between them in silence. The town began to murmur. "You seen how she looks at him," said the butcher's wife. "Or how he watches her like a dog watches a wound," the apothecary added, eyes narrowed. They never spoke it aloud, but the air shifted around her whenever she walked into view. Dry Creek had a way of pressing its judgment down like fog. She felt it settle into her coat, behind her knees, along the curve of her spine. Still, she walked chin up and coat buttoned, as though the weight of whispers couldn't reach the fire growing somewhere inside her ribs. One morning, she found a bundle beside her door wrapped in an old flour sack. Inside was a small pine carving, the likeness of a bird mid-flight, wings flared, as if about to break free of its own wood. She turned it in her hand slowly, thumb running along the ridges. That evening, she left a stitched scarf hanging on a low branch near his fence line. Neither of them spoke about these things. It became a quiet ritual, built from gestures no one else would see. A mended glove left on a fence post, a knot tied to secure her roof that she hadn't made, a handful of snowberries tucked beside her windowsill when supplies ran thin. One evening, she brought coffee. It wasn't good, weak, bitter, more water than roast, but it was hot and came with 2 enamel cups. She'd spotted him near the grove, splitting wood with practiced patience. The axe glinted once, then disappeared in the blur of motion. She approached slow, like approaching a hawk. He didn't turn when she stopped 10 paces behind. She held out the cup. He took it without a word. They stood like that, side by side, steam rising between them in quiet threads. A crow cawed overhead. She sipped, the tin warm in her cracked hands. He sipped too, eyes on the distant ridgeline where pine trees bristled like a prayer. She glanced sideways, studying the strong slope of his jaw, the scar tucked beneath his chin, the stillness of him. He was like the mesa, worn, weather-beaten, immovable. There was a steadiness in him she hadn't known a man could carry. After a time, he handed her back the cup, nodded once, and turned toward his cabin. No goodbye. No thank you. But her heart ached a little when he left, and not from sadness. The next day, children made a game of throwing pebbles at her door when she wasn't looking. One rock cracked the glass pane above her stove. She taped it with a strip of muslin and didn't cry. Not in front of them. That night, the window was fixed. She hadn't even heard him come. More snow fell. The firewood ran low. She gathered what she could, but her hands cracked from the cold and her feet stayed numb well past dawn. Still, she did not ask for help. Pride had grown where shame used to live. The knock surprised her. She opened the door, breath clouding in the moonlight. He stood there again, holding a single lantern and nothing else. His voice, when it came, was low as embers. "The storm will deepen by morning." She nodded. "I'll bring more wood," he said. "Don't let the fire die." Then he left. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the flame in her hearth and fed it slowly. Slivers of kindling, dry cloth, pages from an olden book. As the wind howled, she hummed to the child inside her. Outside, something moved, a figure passing once, twice, maybe more, keeping watch. By morning, the steps were buried in snow, but beside them sat a fresh stack of logs, cut clean and stacked with reverence. She stared at them a long while, one hand over her heart. She hadn't meant to cry, but she did, quietly, facing the fire, while the wind wrapped the world in white and the memory of him lingered like smoke in the rafters. Not from grief, not even from longing. It was the kind of cry that happens when something broken starts to mend. The thaw came slow that year, reluctant and half-hearted. Ice melted from the edges of roofs like tears that had nowhere to go, pooling into ruts that swallowed wagon wheels and tested even the surest foot. Dry Creek shifted in the slush, not softened by spring but sharpened. Suspicion sprouted in the dirt where kindness had failed to bloom. It began with the boy. Small, sickly, red-cheeked from fever. His mother, a young thing with more worry than wit, had taken herbs from the widow's basket 3 days before. A simple trade, a jar of fatback for dried yarrow and lavender wrapped in muslin. She hadn't asked questions. Only desperate mothers can truly recognize each other. But when the boy's cough turned wet and strange, panic overruled memory. By midday, whispers spread like oil on creek water. The Apache's woman gave her poison. She brews spells from the woods. A lie, but lies wear boots in a town like Dry Creek. They walk fast and loud, and they kick truth into the gutter before it even opens its eyes. That evening, a stone shattered the lower pane of her front window. She found it on the floor beside the cradle, smooth, gray, warm from sun, and thrown by someone too cowardly to show their face. She did not cry. Instead, she boarded the gap with what scraps she had and sat by the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the wind moan like it mourned her. Chayton arrived after dusk. He said nothing, but his eyes scanned the damage. He touched the frame with a craftsman's care, noting the splinters, the grain. Then he reached into the satchel at his side and handed her a length of glass already cut, wrapped in oiled cloth. She didn't ask how he'd known. She stood at his side while he fitted it into place, breathing in sawdust and silence. When he finished, she looked at him with more than thanks in her eyes. She looked at him like he was the last familiar shape in a world rearranged by cruelty. He looked back like he understood. The next morning, 3 women refused to take their mending back from her doorstep. The fabric was still there by sunset, gone stiff in the wind. On the 3rd day, the preacher visited, hat in hand and sorrow drawn into the lines of his face. "People are scared," he said. "They don't understand your choices." She smiled without warmth. No one asked them to. He shifted awkwardly. "Best to keep your head down, for the child's sake." She closed the door before he finished. That night, flames woke her. The air snapped sharp with smoke and panic. Her lungs seized as she stumbled to the cradle, gathering the baby blanket, the swaddling, her satchel. Fire licked the window frame in orange hunger. She kicked the door open with bare feet and coughed into the dark. A figure moved through the smoke. She couldn't see him until he reached her, Chayton's face, firelit and fierce, eyes alive with purpose. He took the blanket from her arms, one hand on her shoulder, the other guiding her through the yard already glowing with embers. The shack behind her cracked like bone under strain. Sparks flew like stars in every direction. They did not speak. There was only breath, only movement. He carried her beyond the edge of town to where the trees grew thick and the trail narrowed to nothing. She leaned into his strength, because she had none left. When they reached his cabin, he laid her gently on the cot by the fire and pulled the blanket around her with hands that trembled. He didn't leave her side. In the morning, she woke to the smell of cedar smoke and something boiling, porridge, thickened with dried berries. He crouched near the fire, stirring slowly, his back to her. She touched her belly and felt the flutter of life still tucked safe within. Her voice came soft. "Thank you." He didn't turn, just nodded, and added more water to the pot. The next few days folded in on themselves. The world outside narrowed to 4 walls of quiet shelter. He moved with care, chopping wood, boiling herbs, reinforcing the door with long nails and firm hands. She sewed with numb fingers, wrapping scraps into something that resembled home. For the first time since her husband's death, she began to exhale without flinching. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of his cabin, watching the wind drag the trees in slow arcs. He joined her there, arms crossed. They didn't speak, but the silence between them felt less like distance and more like an offering. 2 bruised souls sharing the same sky. Then came the children, 2 girls from town, lost in the woods while chasing a runaway dog. They found their way to Chayton's cabin near dusk, shivering and wet. The older one had sprained her ankle. He carried her inside, wrapped both in spare blankets, and placed warm cups in their hands. The girls said nothing of fear, only gratitude. He walked them back before dark. By dawn, the story had changed. They were lured, someone claimed. He kept them overnight, for who knows what. She was there too, said another. The widow probably helped him. The gossip rekindled with fury. This time, the sheriff came. He stood just outside the treeline, boots planted in frostbitten grass. His eyes found Chayton's. They didn't speak, but the message passed clear. There was no warrant, not yet. But the storm had returned. That evening, as the fire crackled low, she folded another blanket and placed it on the cot. Her hands worked slowly, steady, but her mouth was tight with knowing. "They'll burn this one too," she whispered. "They'll never stop." Chayton said nothing. He reached into the hearth and stirred the embers back to life. His face lit gold and shadow. She watched him, the curve of his brow, the steadiness of his movements, and something unspoken settled between them. Not fear, not hope either, only readiness. Outside, the night deepened, and far off in town, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Snow came down like breath held too long, soft and slow, and without end. It muted the world until even the crows forgot how to scream. The cabin in the pines, half buried beneath white and wind, held a silence that grew thick in the corners, until the silence broke. It began with a low groan in the dark. She doubled over near the hearth, one hand on the cradle, the other pressed to the small of her back. Pain clawed through her spine like fire-down old timber. Her breath came in sharp bursts. Her jaw clenched until the wood of the stool beneath her creaked. The child inside her turned like thunder inside a storm. Chayton was beside her before she called. He caught her beneath the arms and lowered her to the bedding they'd laid with pine boughs and wool. The fire cracked loud as though it understood the hour had come. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hands moved with a reverence that made her eyes sting. He brewed herbs by instinct, laid cloths to boil, set water by her side. When she cried out, he knelt and pressed his palm to her forehead. There was no fear in his face, only stillness, as though his heartbeat belonged to the mountain itself. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, she did too. The labor was long, a cruel, ancient rhythm that took her into shadows and dragged her back again. She bit down on leather when the pain came too sharp. Blood pooled. The scent of it clung to the rafters, mingling with smoke and snow. She wept once, not from fear, but from the weight of it. The years of silence, the months of hunger, the nights of shame. All of it had come to this one night, this one fire, this one cabin carved into the bones of the forest. And then the cry came, not hers, not his. A high, thin wail split the stillness, the kind of sound that turns the earth gentler and makes even wolves pause in their hunger. The child was born just before dawn, when the storm began to settle. Chayden cradled the newborn in arms that had once wielded blade and bow. He did not tremble, though something in his chest cracked open like thawing ice. He washed the child carefully, wrapped her in muslin warmed by the fire, and laid her against her mother's breast. The woman held her daughter with both hands, blinking away tears that wouldn't stop. "She's perfect," she whispered, though her voice was barely breath. Chayden said nothing. He sat at the edge of the cot and watched them both, eyes unblinking. A long moment passed. Then he reached forward, brushing a finger along the baby's cheek. She flinched, then settled into the touch. Outside, the forest sighed. Days passed in quiet repair. Snow fell less fiercely. The cabin grew warmer. The woman healed slowly, rising only to feed or tend the fire. Chayden did not leave her side for more than an hour at a time. He carved a cradle from pine and lined it with a scarf she had once stitched. He built it by hand, sanding every edge until it shone like polished bone. He never asked to hold the child again. She offered. She found him one morning seated on the floor, rocking the cradle with a gentleness that didn't match the scars on his hands. The baby cooed, gurgled, stared at him with the solemn wisdom of new life. He didn't smile, but something in him eased, like a weight set down that no one else had noticed he'd carried. The days blurred. Snow melted from the roof in slow drips. Sap began to run in the trees. Crows returned to the sky. She began to sing again, softly, old lullabies from her childhood, forgotten tunes that rose without thought as she moved through the quiet. One night, she reached for his hand. No words, no request. She simply took it. He let her. Their hands stayed joined a while the baby slept, while the fire dimmed, while the cabin listened. There was no kiss, no declaration. Only warmth shared between two who had lost too much to risk names for what they felt. The next morning, she packed what few clothes the child would need. Chayden understood without asking. The thaw would bring more than birdsong. It would bring riders, men with small minds and long grudges. She could not live in hiding forever. But for now, for this breath of time, she had found peace in exile. That night, they ate together with the baby cradled between them. The wind passed gently over the rooftop. The moonlight through the window fell on Chayden's face, lighting the quiet pride in his eyes. The woman watched him and knew. He had waited his whole life for something he never thought he'd be allowed to keep. Maybe none of this could last. But here, for now, in the middle of nowhere, something sacred had begun. The first signs of thaw came like whispered warnings, mud bleeding through snowbanks, water trickling beneath tree roots, crows cawing with restless hunger. In the pines, the world stirred, and so did they. The child had begun to smile, toothless and strange, reaching out with fingers like petals toward the morning light. The woman watched her daughter sleep and knew the stillness they'd borrowed had come to its end. Chayden said nothing when she began folding linens into a satchel, wrapping dried meat in oilskin, tying the cradle's shawl tighter against the cold. He simply took up his tools and reforged the wheel on the old handcart. No question passed between them, but understanding filled the silence like water in a dry well. They returned to Dry Creek in early spring, walking slow beside the thawing trail. Her boots sank in muck, her breath visible, the child bundled against her breast in a sling. Chayden walked a few paces ahead, eyes scanning rooftops and shadows. The town was no larger, no louder, just leaner, brittle with waiting. People paused as they passed. Some blinked. Others looked away. She kept her chin up, her steps measured. The blacksmith stopped mid-swing and wiped his brow. The apothecary's wife froze in her doorway, mouth parting as if to speak, but no words came. Even the dogs stilled, sensing a weight in the air too old for barking. They made their way to the general store. Inside, she placed a list on the counter: flour, salt, milk, a bit of cloth. The clerk glanced up, then looked past her to Chayden, standing like a stone outside the door. "Coin?" he asked, voice tight. She laid it down. He took it, said nothing more. It might have ended there. But judgment, like rot, rarely stays buried. As they stepped back into the street, a voice rang out, sharp, high, brittle with pride. "You've no right here." She turned. A man stepped forward from the crowd gathering near the chapel. Clean coat, silver ring, on one hand, sharp eyes. Her husband's brother, Elias. Thinner than she remembered. But the cruelty in his voice was still full. "You left," she said softly. "You were never family," he spat. "And now you walk in with that?" His gaze slid to Chayton. The crowd leaned forward as if pulled by string. "You bring shame to his grave," Elias growled. "Taking up with a savage, feeding his bastard at your breast." Chayton moved then. Not fast. Not loud. He stepped forward with the gravity of storm clouds. And the people parted without touch. His eyes locked on Elias with a calm that cut deeper than fury. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. The blade at his belt stayed sheathed, but the weight of him, was enough to still the street. The sheriff emerged from the tavern steps, slow, steady. He looked older now, wearier. His badge was dull, his gaze sharper than ever. "That's enough," the sheriff said, voice gravellow. Elias sneered. "This is family business." The sheriff's hand drifted to his holster. "Not anymore, it ain't." Silence settled thick as dust. "She belongs here," the sheriff said, nodding toward the woman. "She paid her price. You turned your back. And he," his eyes slid to Chayton, "has done more good for this town than most." Elias's mouth twisted. His hand twitched near his belt. Chayton didn't move. The woman did. She stepped between them, the child quiet against her chest. Her voice was calm, measured, but rang like hammered steel. "You mourned your brother with words. This man saved his child with firewood and silence. You call me shame? You left me to die." Her eyes were clear, her face unflinching. "I won't ask your blessing," she finished, "because I don't need it." No one breathed. The sheriff took one step forward. "Best ride out, Elias, before someone makes you." And like that it broke. Elias turned and shoved through the crowd. No one followed. Slowly, like frost melting from limbs, people began to move. A child waved at the baby. A woman at the edge of the crowd lifted two fingers in a silent nod. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a crack in the wall. A sliver of something new. Chayton turned to her. He didn't speak, but his hand brushed hers. They left Dry Creek without hurry. The cart bumped along the old road, past the fence posts and the outlying farms, past the burned shell of the widow's shack, now overgrown with last year's grass. The baby stirred once, then settled. By dusk, they reached the ridge. The plains stretched wide below them, wild and gold beneath the sinking sun. Ahead, the road led nowhere in particular, but the sky was clear. The wind was gentle. The woman stood beside the warrior who had saved her, not with promises or grand gestures, but with presence and the grace of never walking away. She looked down at her daughter and then up at the horizon. And in that moment she knew she had walked through fire, through shame, through silence. But she had not been broken. She had become. Sometimes the world won't give you a place. Sometimes you build it yourself, with calloused hands, with stitched cloth and kindling, with quiet love that asks for nothing but stays anyway. And when the road begins again, you walk it. You walk it with your head high, your heart full, and your soul unafraid.